Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're really wading into something big, a legislative flood, you could say.
Mm.
If you want a comprehensive, synthesized understanding of where artificial intelligence regulation is actually landing in the United States, this deep dive is, well, it's your blueprint.
Yeah, we're diving into the 2025 state legislative sessions, and the scale is, frankly, pretty staggering. We looked at AI legislation introduced across all 50 states, plus D.C., Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Every single one. They were all moving on this.
That level of activity is just, it's unprecedented, isn't it? Legislators are clearly past the what even is AI phase. We found that 38 states actually adopted or enacted about 100 concrete legislative measures. So this isn't just chatter. These are laws impacting compliance, liability, business models, I know.
Exactly. And our mission today is really to synthesize that huge volume. We're going to pull out the thematic trends, hopefully give you those critical aha moments on where this tidal wave of regulation is really hitting the private sector, how it's changing government operations and maybe preparing or, disrupting the future workforce.
Okay, and to illustrate just how diverse the thinking is, let's maybe look at 3 enacted examples right off the bat. These really show how quickly states are moving from, philosophical debates to actual practical legal enforcement.
Yeah, good idea. Let's maybe start with ownership. It's one of the most fundamental legal questions for generative AI. If an AI makes something, text, art, whatever, who owns it legally?
Sounds like Arkansas tackled that head on with H. 1876.
They did. It's pretty straightforward, actually. They clarified that the owner of AI-generated content is generally the person providing the data or the input. So the prompt, the training data, that sort of thing. It's a very pragmatic, input-based approach to IP.
So the human driving the creation owns it. But I think there's a corporate exception in there too, right?
Exactly. If you create that content as part of your job, your employment duties, then it defaults to the employer. Standard work for hire principle, essentially. But the crucial caveat, and this underpins everything here, is that the content can't infringe on existing copyrights or IP rights. So they're clarifying ownership in the generative space, but not undermining existing IP law.
Okay, got it. That's practical IP. Now let's jump to Montana. They took maybe a broader stance, something about infrastructure and a right to compute.
Montana's S212, yeah, that one's fascinating. It's sort of a two-pronged thing. First, on the regulatory side, it tackles system safety. It requires deployers of critical AI systems, think things, controlling power grids, water systems, that level of importance they have to develop a risk management policy.
And they didn't just say make a policy, they linked it to existing standards.
Right. They mandated using best practices, specifically pointing to standards like the latest AI risk management framework from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. That framework gives everyone a common vocabulary, a way to measure AI risks. By making critical deployers use it, Montana is basically importing federal technical guidance right into state compliance rules.
That makes sense. It gives a standard language for risk, which must be invaluable. Okay, now what about the other part, the right to compute bit? That sounds almost constitutional.
It is quite philosophical. That part of S212 says that the government can't restrict private citizens or companies from owning or using computational resources, hardware, data centers, processing power for lawful purposes, unless, there's an absolutely compelling government interest that mandates the restriction. It's a really powerful, almost protective statement backing tech innovation against potential future regulatory overreach.
Interesting. Okay, and our third example, Oregon's H2748. That shows maybe the philosophical line being drawn around professions.
Yeah, this is basically a legal declaration of non-personhood, but in the context of professional licensing. Oregon explicitly prohibits a non-human entity, and they specifically include AI agents from using certain licensed and certified medical professional titles. They called out titles like registered nurse or certified medication aid.
The implication being
What?
that if an AI could claim the title, maybe it could claim the associated liability or legal standing.
Pretty much. By banning the use of the title, they reinforce that the accountability, the licensure, the responsibility for patient safety has to rest with a human professional. They're saying, look, no matter how good the AI advice seems, the legal buck stops with a licensed human.
Okay, so IP, infrastructure safety, professional liability, those 3 really do show the massive breadth of this legislative wave.
Definitely.
That sets the stage perfectly. Let's unpack our first major thematic trend then. This covers the measures states are taking to deal with immediate, pretty obvious societal harms. We're calling these the reactive laws.
Yeah, this is where you see public anxiety really meeting legislative urgency. When AI capabilities allow for rapid, widespread harm, especially involving kids or election states, tend to move very quickly to update their criminal codes.
Right. Starting with the most sensitive area,
Yeah.
criminalizing digital harms, particularly around child sexual abuse material, or CSAM. The speed that computer-generated stuff can be made means laws have to keep up with synthetic content, doesn't it?
It really does. And across the country, we saw a very clear focus on redefining child pornography to explicitly include AI or computer-generated material. The key legal threshold that multiple states adopted is that the material has to be indistinguishable from an actual minor.
Why is that specific word indistinguishable so important legal? What does it do?
Well, without it, a defense attorney could potentially argue, hey, no actual child was photographed or harmed in making this, so it doesn't meet the definition of child porn under the existing statute.
Hmm.
By including material that's technologically indistinguishable, states essentially close that loophole. They're saying the harm of having or sharing this content is the same, whether a camera lens or an algorithm made the image.
Okay, that makes sense. It focuses on the impact. Which specific states put that standard into law this session?
We saw Kansas enact H82, Minnesota had H2432, and Texas passed S1621. All of them modified their definitions of crimes against children, things like sexual exploitation, child pornography, to specifically include these hyper-realistic computer-generated visual depictions. It's a really crucial kind of harmonized legal update across different states trying to keep pace with Gen AI.
It wasn't just limited to CSAM, right? The criminal definitions also expanded to cover things like basic harassment and stalking, especially as AI tools get more autonomous.
Absolutely. Think about just expanding existing harassment laws. North Dakota's H4167, for instance, now explicitly prohibits using an AI-powered robot to stalk or harass someone. That law effectively broadens who the perpetrator can be beyond just a physical human to include, like, an autonomous digital proxy. It recognizes that abuse can now be carried out by bots and AI agents.
Right. And then maybe the most widely discussed area of digital harm involving adults,
Yeah.
non-consensual explicit images. Deep fake pornography.
Oh, yeah, that was a huge focus this session. Several states passed laws directly prohibiting creating or distributing sexually explicit fabricated images without consent. And importantly, they often provide both criminal penalties and civil actions for victims. So Tennessee enacted S1346, West Virginia enacted S198, Montana passed S413, all creating specific crimes around disclosing this kind of explicit synthetic media. It gives victims much-needed tools for prosecution and for seeking damages.
Okay, so moving on from that explicit content criminalization, let's talk about protecting personal identity and likeness more broadly. The ease of making digital doubles is forcing states to codify what some are calling digital replication rights.
Yeah, it's essentially treating your identity, your voice, your face, how you move, as a kind of defensible property right in the digital age. It's like a modern version of the right of publicity. Arkansas actually took a pretty efficient route here. They just updated their existing law, the Frank Broyles Publicity Rights Protection Act, with H1071.
Ah, so they used an existing framework. That probably avoids a potentially slow, messy fight over defining a totally new right from scratch.
Exactly. Smart legal practice. They just extended the protections to cover situations where someone's photo, voice, or likeness is reproduced using AI and then used commercially without permission. Leverage the established law to tackle the new tech.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Montana, though, they took a more technical definition-focused approach to protecting identity.
Montana's H513 is a good example. They focused on setting a high bar for what counts as an unlawful digital copy. They defined a digital visual depiction as a realistic depiction, used commercially, that's created or altered by digital tech in a way that's nearly indistinguishable from the actual person. Again, with that indistinguishable idea. It sets a high standard for a legal challenge. The defendant would have to prove their use wasn't an indistinguishable commercial copy.
Utah also seemed to focus heavily on the unauthorized commercial use aspect, but were they careful about space for creativity?
Yeah, Utah's S271 expanded abuse of personal identity to include unauthorized commercial use of simulated or artificially recreated identities. But, crucially, they included explicit exemptions for fair use. That recognizes the balancing act legislators face, protecting people from commercial exploitation while still safeguarding things like parody, commentary, other forms of speech that might rely on manipulating likenesses.
Right, that's always a tricky line. Okay, our final point in this reactive section, election integrity, specifically requiring transparency for deepfakes used in political ads.
Yeah, the goal here is pretty clear. Try to preserve trust in election communications. The main legislative trend is mandatory disclosure, often backed up by pretty stiff penalties. South Dakota enacted S-164. It prohibits using a deepfake to influence an election if the person knows it's a deepfake and doesn't include the specified disclosure. And failing to disclose, that's a Class 1 misdemeanor.
So the message is sort of, okay, we might not ban the synthetic media outright in politics, but we will prosecute you if you try to deceive the public about whether it's real or not.
That seems to be the balance they were aiming for. Similarly, North Dakota's H1 requires that political communications using AI to visually or audibly impersonate a human must prominently state a specific disclaimer. Again, the focus is squarely on transparency when a political actor's identity is synthesized.
And Montana's S-25 added something crucial for election law, didn't it? Speed.
Speed is everything in an election cycle, yeah. Montana regulated deepfakes in election comms, defined the terms, set rules, but more importantly, it provided specific remedies that victims could pursue immediately. That includes the ability to seek injunctive relief. An injunction lets a candidate try to stop the fake media from spreading almost instantly. That's way more valuable during, say, the last 2 weeks of a campaign than waiting for a civil damages trial a year down the road.
Definitely. Okay, let's shift gears. Now we turn the regulatory lens inward. It seems clear that before states can really effectively regulate the private sector, they first need to get their own houses in order, right? So what did we see regarding internal government use, policy, and oversight?
Yeah, the first priority for a lot of states seemed to be just establishing internal governance,
Hmm.
mandating basic policy frameworks so that agencies aren't just deploying these powerful AI tools kind of haphazardly.
Right, setting the ground rules. This foundational approach seems pretty clear in Arkansas H. 1958. It just requires public entities to create a policy about the authorized use of AI. Simple compliance, but critical for accountability.
And Texas went quite a bit further. S. 1964 governs the overall regulation and use of AI systems and data management, specifically by state governmental entities. They recognize that if AI is going to handle state data, citizen interactions, there needs to be a uniform policy for how it's managed and deployed.
They also recognize the need to upskill their own people, their employees, which is vital for the private sector too, indirectly. I mean, if a state employee is reviewing your permit application that relied on AI, they need to understand how the system works, don't they?
Exactly right. Texas's H3512 requires mandatory AI training programs for certain employees and officials in state agencies. And why should you in the private sector care? Well, because the competency of government employees directly impacts the speed and reliability of bureaucratic processes. If the state agency reviewing your data center application understands AI, things probably move faster. If they don't, everything could grind to a halt.
That's a good point. And on maybe a national security level, states are also adopting internal security measures, trying to preempt foreign threats by regulating the actual technology they buy.
Yeah, this is a critical security trend, prohibiting the use of what they're calling AI platforms of concern. Kansas with H2313 and Oregon with H3936 both enacted laws prohibiting tech produced by foreign adversaries from being used on state-issued devices and networks. This views certain AI tools not just as software, but as potential espionage vectors, potential critical vulnerabilities that need to be walled off from sensitive government data.
Okay, now turning to accountability. If the government itself is using AI to make decisions about benefits, licenses, services, transparency has to be non-negotiable, right? This brings us to mandating human oversight and transparency in government decisions.
Accountability is really the engine driving this whole segment. Kentucky passed S4. It requires a clear and conspicuous disclaimer whenever generative AI or AI systems are used to make any decision about individual citizens or businesses.
Okay, so if a system denies your unemployment claim, you have to know an algorithm was involved. But what does conspicuous disclaimer actually look like in practice? Is it just a footnote?
Well, the law implies more than just a footnote. It needs to be visible, understandable to the average person. Ideally, it should probably direct them to a human for review or appeal. The law really puts the burden on the agency to make sure the citizen knows their interaction or the decision was mediated by AI.
And Utah addressed this accountability gap very directly within law enforcement specifically.
Utah's S-180, yeah, that was part of a police reform measure. It's a perfect example of mandating human review. It requires law enforcement agencies to have a policy on using generative AI. And crucially, if a police report is created, even partially, by generative AI, it must include a specific disclosure statement. And the human author, the officer, has to certify the report's accuracy. That's the human-in-the-loop principle basically codified into policing. The AI might generate the text, but the sworn officer takes legal responsibility for whether it's true.
That model human certification for accuracy seems like something we might see replicated across other high-stakes government processes. We also see some pending legislation in California trying to define what a high-risk system even is and how it should be governed.
California is definitely pushing the envelope on high-risk systems regulation. They've got pending bills like S-420 and S-833. These propose requiring really rigorous impact assessments and human oversight mechanisms, especially for critical infrastructure operators using AI. They're not enacted yet, but they signal a trend toward defining which AI applications, because of their potential for systemic failure or massive public harm, need to go through the most stringent pre-deployment checks.
Okay, and finally in this government section, let's talk money. The cold, hard cash needed to actually deploy these systems.
Yeah.
Financial and administrative investment.
Yeah, the reality is modernizing government with AI is expensive. So we saw a heavy reliance on appropriations measures just to fund these initiatives. Alaska, H-53, New York, A3000, Utah, S3, they all included specific, often multi-million-dollar appropriations dedicated to various AI projects within their state budgets.
California, though, seems to be demanding stricter formal oversight of that spending.
They seem to want to prevent runaway AI projects, yeah. California enacted S-101. It requires that generative AI projects in state departments have to be explicitly approved, either through the Annual Budget Act or some other specific statute. They're demanding transparency and direct legislative sign-off for big AI investments, basically ensuring the tech serves a clear public purpose before the money gets spent.
And Louisiana had a really interesting, very specific appropriation. It shows how local judicial needs are driving AI adoption, too.
Louisiana's H1, yeah, that included money for the Lafourche Parish District Attorney's Office to set up a partnership with Nichols State University, the stated goal, to enhance investigative capabilities using AI analysis tools. It shows funding isn't just going to big centralized state IT departments, it's also driving targeted, practical, maybe even crime-fighting applications right at the local judicial level.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move on. Now let's turn to where AI directly impacts your wallet, your shelter, your health. This section focuses on algorithmic accountability in these high-impact private sectors, starting with the housing crisis and algorithmic pricing.
Right, and this is where you see antitrust law just colliding head-on with data analytics. I mean, imagine you're a property owner, or maybe more likely, a renter. You wake up, your rent's jumped 15%. Not because your human landlord decided that, but because an algorithm figured out your neighborhood could bear it. And maybe that same algorithm is advising every other major landlord in your area simultaneously. That's the core problem states are trying to grapple with.
Yeah, it's that idea of a digital price-fixing cartel. How are states trying to legally define this and attack it? It seems tricky.
It is tricky. The legislative focus is pretty novel. They're trying to prohibit or regulate algorithms that are trained on or fed non-public competitor data. The legal theory is, look, if multiple landlords pool their non-public, sensitive data like vacancy rates, specific pricing strategies into one single analytic tool, that tool effectively ends independent price setting. It acts like a central coordinator, achieving collusion without anyone needing to explicitly agree in a smoky back room.
So the regulation targets the input, the data going in, and the mechanism of the algorithm itself rather than just the final price output. Which states are leading this kind of regulatory charge?
You see this concept popping up in pending legislation all over, which shows a strong consensus, at least on the potential threat. California's A325, Illinois's H12027, Minnesota's S2087, New Hampshire's H558. They all have provisions trying to ban pricing algorithms that use non-public competitor data to set or recommend rental prices.
But it's not politically easy, is it? I think Colorado vetoed a similar measure.
That's a really crucial data point, yeah. Colorado vetoed H1004, which concerned this kind of pricing coordination among landlords. It highlights the intense industry pushback you see. Opponents argue, hey, regulating data sharing restricts innovation, it restricts efficient resource allocation. That veto proves that while the regulatory desire might be widespread, the economic controversy around it is still really intense.
New York, though, seems pretty determined to tackle this. They're targeting the software providers themselves.
New York's S7882, which was sent to the governor, it stands out for being very direct. It prohibits persons or entities from knowingly or recklessly facilitating an agreement between rental property owners not to compete by using software, data analytics, or algorithmic devices. So this bill specifically puts liability on the intermediary, the software company, providing the tool that enables the coordination. Makes it harder to hide collusion behind just a technical service agreement.
Okay, let's pivot to healthcare now. How are states trying to ensure that AI doesn't become this sort of automated gatekeeper that prioritizes cost savings over patient care, specifically looking at prior authorization and claims decisions?
Yeah, the core legislative goal here is pretty clear. Protect patients from automated claim denials. Ensure that cost-saving algorithms don't just override medical necessity judgments made by actual human doctors.
And we saw a really powerful legal mechanism being used here,
Yeah.
shifting the burden of proof. It sounds like it's designed to make the insurer work much harder to deny care.
Yes. This is done using something called a rebuttable presumption. For anyone not familiar with that legal term, basically a rebuttable presumption means a court, or in this case, maybe a regulator, has to assume a fact is true unless someone proves otherwise.
Okay, so how does that actually play out when an automated system denies a health claim?
Well, both Connecticut S10 and Indiana S480 enacted laws strengthening their utilization review requirements. They create a rebuttable presumption that a healthcare service ordered by a medical professional is medically necessary. This puts the burden squarely on the utilization review entity, the insurer, or the algorithm they're using to prove that the service is not medically necessary. It radically shifts the litigation risk and the administrative cost away from the patient and onto the insurer.
That seems significant. Maryland focused specifically on mandating quality standards for how these tools are used.
Right. Maryland enacted H820. It requires carriers, pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, the companies managing prescription drug benefits, and review agents to make sure that AI algorithms or other software tools are used in a certain manner for utilization review. This essentially mandates sticking to established quality and clinical appropriateness standards when you automate claim decisions.
Texas also passed S815, regulating automated systems in the health benefit claims process. And Utah targeted a very specific consumer-facing use case, mental health chatbots.
Yeah, the Utah Mental Health Chatbot Act, H452, is a really interesting example of targeted, maybe anticipatory regulation. It requires specific disclosures to users. It prohibits certain uses of personal information collected by the chatbot. And quite uniquely, it provides a safe harbor for suppliers who follow the policy requirements. It's very localized, addressing the immediate risk of an unregulated mental health app rather than waiting for some massive multi-sector federal law that might never come.
Okay, our final accountability segment here covers the workforce, hiring, and job displacement. This is where the algorithm essentially acts as the manager.
Right. States are recognizing that automated decision systems, or ADS basically, systems using computation to help with or even replace human judgment, are now central to hiring, firing, promotion, performance management, all of it. California's pending S7, for example, would require employers using an ADS for employment-related decisions to give written notice to all the affected workers. That notice would have to include a description of the ADS and what its purpose is.
So transparency is kind of the baseline requirement. But the bigger economic question is around displacement, isn't it? What happens when AI makes an employee redundant?
That is the crucial tension point. New York's pending S 1854 is one of the most ambitious proposals we saw in this area. It suggests a tax or a surcharge on corporations for employees who are displaced by AI, and it would require an AI impact assessment before deployment. The philosophy here seems to be that the state should make the company internalize the external cost of automation, maybe using that revenue to fund workforce transition and education programs.
That's a very direct regulatory approach, aimed at slowing displacement or maybe funding the aftermath. Iowa, though, provides a great counterpoint to that approach.
Iowa does, yeah. With their enacted S647, they focus much more on the proactive investment solution. They allocated appropriations specifically targeting workforce needs by expanding STEM programs, including AI, cybersecurity, data science. So instead of a punitive regulation maybe aimed at preventing job loss, Iowa is legislating more on the side of reskilling, trying to ensure the incoming workforce is actually prepared for the automated economy.
Two very different philosophies there. Okay, let's broaden out again for our final section. Let's connect AI to the larger long-term trends shaping the nation,
Hmm.
starting with infrastructure and the massive energy footprint of AI.
Yeah.
This is where AI policy suddenly becomes utility policy, environmental policy.
Yeah, this is a rapidly emerging area. It's really driven by the realization that training and running these large generative AI models takes data centers that consume just enormous amounts of power, sometimes comparable to entire cities. So states are trying to figure out, okay, who pays for that new energy demand and how does it affect our climate goals?
California's A222 seems to focus on transparency first. Just mandating that generative AI developers calculate and report the total energy used to develop their big models. It's like an accounting measure, right, to reveal the true costs.
Exactly. But New Jersey is proposing requirements that are much, much more aggressive, more prescriptive. They're directly linking AI development to renewable energy policy. Their pending bills, A5564 and S4143, propose requiring energy usage plans for AI data centers. And, critically, mandating that all electricity for these facilities must come from new clean energy sources.
Hold on, new clean energy sources, not just buying existing green power credits or
It's
something.
new clean energy. The idea is to make sure that the massive new electricity load demanded by these centers doesn't just siphon off existing renewable capacity from the grid, because if it did, the rest of the grid might have to rely more heavily on fossil fuels to make up the difference. New Jersey is effectively demanding that AI data centers have to fund and build new green infrastructure just to support their own growth. That is a pretty radical, potentially growth-shaping proposal.
Wow, okay. Meanwhile, North Carolina seems focused more on utility fairness, protecting the average citizen from footing the bill for this huge industrial energy demand.
Right. North Carolina, through their pending bills H638 and H1002, is focused on protecting residential ratepayers. The goal is to prevent the grid or energy costs incurred solely for serving these massive data centers, which often need costly infrastructure upgrades from being passed on to regular residential customers. They want those huge energy costs assigned specifically to the direct beneficiaries, the data centers themselves. It's a big political and economic fight over who pays for infrastructure investment and how utility costs get allocated.
Makes sense. Okay, shifting to education now. States are clearly prioritizing AI literacy. Right across the board, it seems, from K-12 up through higher ed, trying to ensure the next generation is ready for this automated world.
Yeah, this is a huge structural shift happening in educational policy. Ohio's enacted H96 requires their Department of Education and Workforce to develop a model policy on just the appropriate use of AI by students and staff. So they're focusing immediately on how to integrate AI responsibly into the existing classroom structure right now.
Georgia, though, is taking maybe the longest view we saw, committing to a really foundational change in the curriculum itself.
Georgia, yeah, with pending bills H487 and S179, they're pushing towards making computer science a high school graduation requirement. Starting way out in the 2031-2032 school year, that's a fundamental change, often allowing computer science to substitute for other core credits like a fourth year of science or math. It really signals that technical literacy is now seen as equivalent to those traditional academic pillars.
And Tennessee's approach seems focused not just on using the tools, but on critical consumption, understanding the output.
Tennessee's pending S514 and H531 mandate age-appropriate instruction on how to access, utilize, and critically evaluate various AI tools. That recognizes that in a world full of generative content, the ability to spot deepfakes, identify bias, see inaccuracies, that's just as vital as knowing how to write a good prompt. It's really about teaching digital citizenship for the age of generative models.
Right. And finally, New Jersey again, backing its educational goals with actual money through A4700.
That's always the key piece, isn't it? Funding. Appropriations specifically dedicated to AI career and technical education expansion, and also innovation grants in education. So states aren't just mandating new subjects, they're funding the vocational and technical training needed to ensure that as AI reshapes the labor market, the incoming workforce is actually prepared for the jobs that remain, and hopefully the new jobs that emerge too.
Okay. Wow. This deep dive has really revealed, I think, three powerful converging currents in state legislative action this past session. First, you have these immediate reactive measures trying to protect the public from obvious harms.
Yeah.
Legislating against deepfakes, CSAM, identity theft, basic safety stuff. Second, there's this focus on internal governance. Making sure state government itself uses AI responsibly requires human oversight, transparency in its own decisions.
Right. And third, this much more complex regulation targeting algorithmic accountability in those high-stakes private sectors, trying to fight digital price fixing in housing, protecting patients from automated claim denials in healthcare, managing workforce impacts. The states are really starting to draw lines around where algorithms need to be subservient to human interests and judgment.
But maybe the most profound takeaway for you, the listener, is this sort of philosophical line being drawn in the sand. It's a debate happening almost quietly within the legal definitions of these bills about the very nature and the legal status of artificial intelligence itself.
Yeah, it really comes down to the question of personhood, doesn't it?
Yeah.
On one hand, you've got states like Oregon. With H 2748, they drew a hard line, explicitly prohibiting a non-human entity from claiming professional titles like registered nurse.
Mm-hmm.
They're legislating what AI legally is not. It's not a licensed professional entity.
And then you have states like Tennessee with those pending bills, H. 849 and S. 837. They're proactively defining foundational legal terms like human being and natural person, specifically to exclude AI, computer algorithms, software programs.
Just think about the implications of that move for a second. Why does a state feel the need to clarify in its basic statutory definitions that a person cannot be an AI? It shows legislators aren't just worried about regulating the technology anymore. They're preemptively concerned about the future legal status of advanced intelligence. This is a fundamental philosophical position being encoded into state law right now.
So, as states are grappling with the very technical regulation of AI in, say, utilities and housing, they are also, maybe unintentionally sometimes, preemptively deciding the future legal status of artificial intelligence. What does it even mean for society when the definition of personhood has to be explicitly written into state law just to keep a machine out? That question, I think, really defines the era of regulation we're just entering.
It's the ultimate layer of complexity, really, underlying this entire wave of regulation we've been discussing.
Food for thought indeed, as these legislative battles will undoubtedly continue to evolve. Thank you so much for guiding us through this incredibly dense but really important body of work.
It was a pleasure, as always.
And thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more insights from the cutting edge of change.